Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 853rd New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and today I have the huge pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation and reading featuring Bernard Schwartz and Ricardo Maldonado and Cole Swensen. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Bernard Schwartz is director of the 92nd Street Y's Unterberg Poetry Center, where he's worked since 2005. His writing has appeared in the New York Times and LitHub. Ricardo Maldonado was born and raised in Puerto Rico. His books include The Life Assignment, which was a finalist for the Poetry Society of America's Norma Farber First Book Award, among other recognitions. He is the recipient of fellowships from numerous foundations and is currently part of the Puerto Rican Literature Project, a forthcoming online database collecting the creative output of Puerto Rican poets in the diaspora and archipelago. In June 2023, Maldonado was named the next executive director and president of the Academy of American Poets. And our host today, Cole Swensen, is the author of 17 volumes of poetry and a collection of critical essays called Noise That Stays Noise. A book of hybrid poem essays, Art in Time, was published by Nightboat in 2021. She's been the recipient of multiple prestigious fellowships and awards for her work and has translated also over 20 volumes of poetry, prose, and art criticism from French and won the 2004 PEN USA Award in Literary Translation. We are so honored and excited to have you all here in conversation today. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Cole.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here and for coming to this, what's going to be a great event. Publishing in Transit, we do it once a month, usually the last Thursday of the month at 1 o'clock. And it's simply a chance to celebrate the people, organizations, presses who are kind of behind the scenes, often not very visible, who actually make poetry and other literatures possible. So we always thank people very much for their work and their efforts, and then we just ask them lots of questions. So you'll get a chance to ask them questions too at the end. We always like to start with poetry. So we're going to start with Bernard Schwartz reading some things that he's chosen. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Cole. Before reading, I want to thank Chloe and Eleanor and the Brooklyn Rail. It's very flattering to be asked to do this sort of thing and to do it with Ricky, who I've not spoken with since he announced he was leaving the Y. Only kidding, we spoke this morning. But it is bittersweet that he is leaving the Y after our working together for 16 years. But I think, as this conversation will reveal, we'll be in close contact still, both personally, obviously, and professionally. I also wanted to just say publicly congratulations to Ricky. Okay, so I've been cajoled into reading and will be reading a poem by Mark Strand. There's a little bit of backstory. It's entitled Wallace Stevens Comes Back to Read His Poems at the 92nd Street Y. Strand wrote this poem in early 1990s, and it was going to be published by The New Yorker, but never appeared in the magazine, never appeared in any of Strand's collections. And it was only after we found a galley proof in the Poetry Center archive author files, which are behind me, and sent it to The New Yorker, that they rediscovered it, and it was published in the anniversary issue of The New Yorker in February of this year. And it goes like this. Wallace Stevens comes back to read his poems at the 92nd Street Y by Mark Strand. It was a willfulness an exertion which verged at once on fluency, that I should appear as I did today, out of light blue air, in a dark blue suit. In the time that I have been gone, I never outgrew the sensation of being, nor for a moment forgot which world was mine. I clung to the merest whispers, the faintest echoes that rose from below. For years, I lay on a down-filled sofa, alone with my passions. Bright refrains of endless azure circled the hours and filled me with pleasure. But the poems I wrote were dulled by the sort of calm one feels in the downward drift of sleep. They never became the relics of light I wished them to be. In the days when it could be said I was one of you, I loved the beyond, as somebody only can who is bound by the earth. All that I wrote was a hymn to desire, to the semblances and stages of bliss. My poems bore only a passing likeness to the life of which they were the miraculous part. But when I was born among the erasures of heaven, I began to believe that whatever was distant or puzzling could never be made too obvious. Of course, I was wrong. I'd allowed myself to be swayed by a vision of plainness that would have all things turn into one idea. So much for the past. May the worst of it fall by the wayside tonight. May other, more intricate powers convene. May the words that I speak be the ones you hear.
Thank you very much. That really gets us off to a good start, thinking about the history and the place of the why. And I know you have some images that are going to take us through some archival material that I think will give people a really good idea of the scope of the why's history. So maybe let's go into those and then we'll go from there. And as we discussed, many of these are self-explanatory, but if you want to add a note, just leap in.
How did you all begin to gather these materials?
So if I may jump in, it's I can't help but sit in reverence and silence whenever I see these documents, either at the Y or anywhere else. But we have archives. We've archived ephemera, by which I mean marketing collateral, as well as letters dating back to the center's inception. And those are documents we hold. That's the treasure, right? That's the history. And many of these documents, we arranged for the celebration of our 75th anniversary. And what year, Bernard? Remind me.
2013.
2013.
Yeah, we're 85 this year. Ginsburg objected to the curtain being brought down on Norman Mailer for reading obscene couplets.
And we can end there with John reading from our stage.
Yeah, I mean, the only annotation I would offer in this forum around these images and objects and documents is that in many instances we have archival recordings, many of which have been shared online. So if somebody appeared for reading or other event at the Poetry Center from really 1949 onward, we've got audio recordings of them, and often have tried to pair those recordings with contemporary authors to demonstrate what is obvious, I'm sure, to this group, that writers keep their forebears close.
Yeah, that's well put. So maybe we'll segue into the conversation at this point. But one thing that I think everybody would like to know is how are such documents publicly available? If one goes to the Y, can one ask to see any of these things? Are they available online? If you would have something to say on that.
Sure. I mean, this is just a tip of the iceberg, highlights that were culled and curated for exhibitions. The calendar is the friend of institutions like the Y. The Y is turning 150 as we speak. So all of these file cabinets behind me contain author folders, and in those author folders are letters and contracts and photographs, etc. We have other folders related to events year by year, decade by decade. So, some of that's been digitized and publicly disseminated when we have done these kinds of public exhibitions. We often have researchers who just ring us up and say, do you have recordings of Denise Levertov? At this point, we can proudly say that a lot of that archive is digitized and, pretty much at our fingertips. And we've embarked on any number of grant-funded projects, either to do digitization or to do transcription of the digitized audio. And we're working right now on a big project to not only take the transcriptions of digitized recordings and disseminate really the entire corpus in the coming next few years, but to work with digital humanists and other scholars to suggest that the history of the Poetry Center as a data set has something to say about the history of literature, its making and its reception, really from the late 30s until the present day.
Right. Ricky?
I wanted to add, right, so there are ways in which history has been recorded and made at the Poetry Center since its inception, but there's still history that's being made and that exists outside of these records, right? And that's history that's made in conversations, in classrooms, right? There is no data, there is no documentation other than this is when a workshop was offered, for example, or this is when a poet won the discovery contest. We have a poem that we published that day. But a lot of the work that we do is in some ways unaccountable. And that's something that we also have to keep in mind when we speak about our history and about our impact into the future.
Really good point there, because it's making me think, okay, there are all these huge names that we know, these just absolute pillars of 20th century, 21st century literature, but there are also the countless people who attend your workshops and someday may also be highly recognized writers, but the importance of the Y. Would you talk a little bit about how the Y does that kind of community connection? And I was particularly interested in hearing about the Young Writers Workshop.
Of course, let me take that one because the Young Writers Workshop was an idea I had after teaching at Columbia through their high school program for years. We serve writers of all backgrounds and ages through our writing program. It is as old as the reading series. And in the slides, you may have seen an assignment that Auden shared with his students way back when. And it's been written extensively about. You can find, I believe there's a story on the Paris Review online. In any case, so we've offered literary seminars as well as creative writing workshops since day one. And we've been pretty active in the creative writing community. It is not a degree granting program, so you will not have students taking classes so that they receive a degree at the end. This is adult education, which means in many cases, folks will be coming straight from work after an 8-hour day to work on a poem or a short story or a novel, whatever it is that they're into. Many of them will take several workshops with us. Up to the point where they can start officially working on a manuscript. I myself took many workshops at the Y after finishing my MFA at Columbia. Why? Because I need a community. I felt very alone after finishing my MFA, meaning I can't really put my finger on it, but I couldn't find community, even though I was very close to many of the poets I hung out with. And I shared work with many of them, but I felt rudderless in some way. And so I came to the Y and I was very interested in the writing workshop and what the writing workshop could make possible for young writers. And so since then, since our start, we've been curating advanced workshops, open enrollment workshops, thesis workshops, year-long novel generators. Our intention is to provide that community, right? In whatever way that is needed. We speak to our students, we ask for courses they may want to take, formats they may want to undertake. And that also comes with being pretty active in the communities, right? Speaking to members of our community often, whether it is formally through a workshop or informally, say at a reading in the city, at a reading at the Y, etc.
And what ages do the
Sure. I forgot to mention the Young Writers Workshop. I'll really focus on it. It's a 3-week program that takes the best that the Poetry Center has to offer, by which I mean it's a group. We have about 20 or so students meeting in 2 cohorts, and they do literary seminars, basically reading to write. They learn how to read critically and how to unlock new writing based on what they are discussing, and then they do a workshop in the evening. So they are introduced to what a workshop could potentially offer a community of young writers. In addition to those 2 components, they get to study the work of a living writer who comes to visit with them at the end of each week. First week is poetry week, then fiction, and then creative nonfiction. And so they get to meet writers who are actually doing the work, are in the city or somewhere in the world trying to make it as a writer.
Great.
And that felt important to all of us, the Poetry Center, for many reasons, one of which is in my experiences as a former teacher, writers were not in many cases taught as folks who were living, right? So there's the canon, and most of the writing, poems, short stories that students were reading were from writers who have died hundreds of years ago. And I think it can be quite a revelation and perhaps empowering for them to meet people who, in many cases, look like themselves or have very similar backgrounds, take the stage, right? Share new work. And there was a reason for all of this. This is the program I would have wanted to take as a young writer myself. This is the program that could have made my life so much easier. It took me years to get to something like this.
It's a program I would have loved to take too.
Exactly.
And I bet everybody here today is going, yeah, why didn't they have it when I was 12 years old?
Yeah.
So great thing to. Bernard, how about you? How did you come to the 92nd Street Y? And what have been some of the most important aspects for you?
Yeah, I mean, I came as a young person who'd moved to New York after college, not knowing what he was going to do, and quite fortuitously became friendly with the people who occupied the jobs that, you know, Ricky and I do or recently stopped doing. So it was a revelation to be able to attend readings at the Y when I was, you know, in my early 20s, and then an honor to, you know, be able to take up a job here. Both Ricky and I have worked with the Y for a long time, and both of us started, you know, as administrative assistants. So it's the sort of place that you can kind of grow up, and I think distinguished from any number of other literary or performing arts organizations, a place where, in addition to the arts, you know, we've got a gym and we've got a senior center, and we've got kids running around all the time. Some of them are my kids. It's to say that the deep roots of the Y, I think, serve to you know, both, you know, inspire the work that we do for writers or on behalf of writers, and in building out our community, but they also, I think, allow us as human beings to be better versions of ourselves. So it's the kind of place that is not merely this or that thing, but by virtue of being many things, that sort of is the most inspiring, I think, thing about the Y. And it's in the same way fortuitous that I would have found myself here, somewhat sort of strange and wonderful that a place like the 92nd Street Y even has a poetry center, but we do.
So I'm glad you brought up all the other activities, because the 92nd Street Y is this amazingly vibrant place. How about cross-pollination? Do you find things like, does the senior center overflow into the poetry? Does the dance overflow into, do things end up cross-pollinating?
Yeah, they do, in ways that are sort of formalized and public, where we'll do collaborations, you know, with the folks who are primarily running our concert series or our dance center, our visual arts department, chiefly with the folks who do education outreach. That's obviously very important to us. And then all of the ways in which you just are bouncing off each other all day long and sharing what you're doing and what you're excited about or challenged by. And I think something that is always of note when you're just walking the halls here is the room where the seniors play mahjong is the room where the kids have their workshops, or in the evening time, you know, where these visiting writers come before they take the main stage. And so these sites of cultural memory are incredibly rich, but rich in manifold ways that if you don't live here, as Ricky and I basically have done for years, you may not have a full appreciation of.
Yeah. Ricky, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like a lot of my programmatic interests came from walking through the building, identifying, we're talking about readers, right? And the potentiality of a reader wanting to become a writer immediately after an event or potentially into the future. And so a lot of it came from seeing folks walk through the door. But even that awareness activated spaces outside the Ys, outside the boundaries of the Y, so that a workshop being sponsored by another organization or international organization became the kernel of an idea for a project as well. So it was always being open for me and for us to the possibility of an event or a conversation between reader and writer to become kernel or the germ of a potential idea for us. And in many ways, it's like we were constantly in a volta. We were constantly waiting for a volta to come.
Right. What a very productive space it sounds like. And the crossing over, the hybridization sounds really important. Both of you have been there for so long. What's your perspective on what's changed in American poetry in the years you've been there?
Well, I think Ricky should speak about
I'm gonna
that.
jump in because this is a question that I've been thinking about as a poet and archivist myself, and I feel like it is that intersection of poetic work being a kind of archive that I feel like is coming to the surface, is rising to the surface. There is a lot of work that's responding to source documentation, particularly documentation surrounding areas of neglected history. And I feel like that's the word that comes to me in Spanish is vertiente, but it feels like that is a strain that I find very interesting and very inspiring. The movement towards rearticulating, reassessing past sites of memory with hopes of creating a fairer future with futurity in mind. And that's something that's becoming more and more obvious. I'm seeing a lot of project-driven work. And that's not to say that all the work out there is project-driven, but that's the one I seem to be responding to the most as a reader myself. And partly due to the fact that I cannot write it. So I cannot write that kind of work, even though I read it voraciously.
Why can't you write it?
Because it escapes me. I don't have the kind of mind that gives me the ability to look at the wider picture, at least not yet. But that could mean that I haven't found the right project for me.
And Bernard, what have you seen change in the years you've been there? And just thinking about international poetry, American poetry, what drifts and trends do you see?
I mean, I am so allergic to speaking generally that it would be hard for me to utter anything that didn't sound foolish, except to say that we see this slideshow of great moments in the literary history as we've done, or talk of the 85th anniversary enfolded in the 150th anniversary. And I think one of the exciting things about having perched at a place like the Y is the way that we mark these occasions is by seeding the future. So for these anniversaries, we put our money where our mouth is and have begun commissioning evening length works from contemporary poets. And I don't know what that future looks like, but the idea that you would be supporting a project that would be a couple years in turnaround time, that would have a kind of on-stage debut featuring, you know, high-profile actors that would turn into a piece or in large part of a new collection, is something that is one of those you know, watch this space ideas that I think drives the work that we do, and is at the same time very closely connected to all of the commemoration. I think we have figured out a way to be both simultaneously commemorative and commissioning, and for the commissions to arise out of sort of legacy and lore, means that, as Ricky said, we're sort of, you know, there at the Volta. And I've always appreciated, I think Ricky does too, I think in part because of the historical reputation of the Poetry Center within, you know, the context of the Y and also the literary community, we have a certain amount of autonomy, you know, and are free within the institution to do the sorts of programming that we'd like to do, but also as eclectically as we'd like to, while at the same time, I think, maintaining a strong sense of self. And that's another combination of virtues or values that I think are rare, that we've been lucky to find and cultivate.
And I wanted to add to that point something that has not remained, or that exists in the periphery of this conversation, at least for me, is recent conversations about canon and what is pushed towards the future, and a refrain that keeps coming back to me is, as I not only encountered newer poets, younger poets, but also reread the work of the past, is how by nature, by definition, poetry has been a political art form. And it seems to me that every time I rediscovered work, I was rediscovering its relevancy. And that's not to say that that all poetic policies and politics should be taken at face value, right? There are some that need to be pushed against, re-envisioned, re-articulated, but it was refreshing to me, having done MFA studies in the early 2000s, and what I felt was an allergy towards poetic work, or overly poetic political work, how political work has been deeply relevant for centuries. And I feel like, you know, you look at, we started with a picture of Langston Hughes, who read at the Poetry Center on our first season, right, Bernard? I always seem to forget if he was first or second, but his work was deeply political since day one, right? And there's that conversation that has been had since day one at the Poetry Center, and we exist within that continuum, right? And who will be the Langston Hughes of the next 5 years or the next 100 years, right? I would like to be there for that, or at least I was for 16 years.
Right. I want to touch again on this idea of the commission, because that's something that's very unusual in poetry. And I was wondering if you envision it as being collaborative. You mentioned something about actors, and I would just love to hear a little bit more about the specific shapes and directions you see that going in.
Yeah, I mean, the powers that be came to all of the program centers around the 150th and said, you know, what would you want to do? And the center's idea was, well, how do you take a piece of the Poetry Center history and see it as inspiring something that you would bring into the future? And as we saw in that slideshow, you know, the Y was there, and played a formative role in the sort of creation of Dylan Thomas's Under Milkwood, at least as a theatrical experience. There's all kinds of tales around, you know, Dylan's relationship to the Y as having brought him to the US for his debut, and also being the stage on which, as a cast, Under Milkwood played and was recorded. That recording still exists. You can listen to it. And it wasn't so much the specific idea to ask poets of today to somehow respond to or interrogate or be inspired by Under Milkwood. It was, what had the Y done then that it could do now? So identifying the voices today that would be really interesting to hear from in an evening length form, which is to say, not quite a book length form, but writing for voices, as Dylan Thomas did in that piece. So it's absolutely collaborative. It begins with a poet with an assignment that we've commissioned, and then it'll be turned over to actors and directors, and we'll find its public form, at least initially, here at the Y in the coming years. It'll be interesting to see, what happens. Absolutely, along the lines of what Derek Walcott did. Derek Walcott did those plays, and James Heaney did those plays, and others have done those plays. Not entirely, because the Y sort of commissioned them, but certainly the Y was a place where those plays would get really prominent public readings, which is to say, here in New York City, and with high profile actors. And so it's hard to wrangle poets, who you've commissioned, and some of the commissions that we hope to land in the 150th may not come in until the 155th. We'll see. But it's a good idea when the writers are excited and say yes, and we'll see what comes of it.
Yeah, as you say, it's a watch this space sort of moment, and I think we'll all be watching for that. That was really great. And thinking about collaboration, Ricky, with your going to the Academy of American Poets, what kind of collaborations might develop between the Academy and the Y?
So I firmly believe, and this is something that Bernard and I have discussed over the years, but firmly believe that for poetry to remain relevant and robust, there must be nourishment of the ecosystem. I understand the need for silos once in a while, but I'm not sure if I understand it, but I believe that the best work comes from working together, from really understanding ourselves as part of a thriving community. Because in many ways, isn't that what the workshop should aspire to be? Isn't that what the commerce between, and I use commerce in quotation marks, between writer and reader, or writer, I guess that's what I meant to say. Isn't that what it is all about? I grew up as an administrator at the Poetry Center, and I can't help but think of all the experiences I had with, say, the Young Writers Workshop or the writing program or our online literary seminars. I feel like not only am I a better person and writer, but like I'm a better administrator. And I feel like the Poetry Center seeded something in me. And there are experiences that I feel like are absolutely important for us to keep working on together. One of them being emphasizing the need for programming that's tailored to younger readers, restating the need for poetry in everyday life, specifically with younger writers and younger readers who do not understand its relevancy. For some reason, they are not, some of them are, but I feel like put a poet in front of them and things will change. And I feel like the Poetry Center does that really beautifully, and that's something that I want to sustain and support and work together on. Also, the obvious fact that I do not have a concert hall at the Academy of American Poets, right? Yeah, I want to go everywhere, and they already do, right? The Academy already does terrific work.
And what other organizations does the Y collaborate with?
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about the Poetry Center, it
Yeah.
sort of depends on the program. We've got a long history, which is, depending on how you look at it, either I think welcomed or somewhat underwhelming around when a big name poet dies, getting together with the sister literary organizations and paying some kind of public tribute. That seems to always be the easiest way of getting the Academy or the Poetry Society, Poets House, what have you, other publishers together, right? Mary Oliver has died and we'll do a big public tribute, or someone's centenary has come. I think that, as Ricky does, there should always be more collaboration. In fact, there tends to be, it just tends to be informal and less sort of publicly pronounced as co-sponsorship or what have you. I think one of the things that happens is that these institutions are hard to run, and so you're focused on doing that, and getting out of the institution, talking to others who themselves are struggling to run their own institutions, makes those conversations far less frequent. I think there's also a question of sort of trust, which Ricky and I happily have in spades. In terms of collaborations, it sort of is event by event or program by program. Obviously, we work very closely with a lot of publishers. In the past, when bringing international writers in particular, would work very closely with different countries' cultural wings, largely around funding or audience development. And then here and there, we work with Scholastic to help get students enrolled in scholarship assistance in the Young Writers Workshop. So it sort of depends on what the thing is and who you want to work with. It was interesting in the last year or so, when our concert halls were under renovation, we did events off-site. So we went from doing events only at the Y to doing events only on Zoom to doing events entirely off-site. And that was fun because we got to talk to people at places like MoMA and the Schomburg Center. And I hope that will continue. I think it will continue, but that too is tricky because we're used to playing home games, and there's all sorts of advantages to playing a full schedule of home games.
Yeah. I do want to say also, because we are invested not only in the live event as it takes place, but on potential future lives, we have collaborated with podcasts. For example, Latino USA on 2 events. One of them was with Valeria Luiselli on the children migrant crisis, and the other one with on Esmeralda Santiago and the 25th anniversary of the publication of When I Was Puerto Rican, right? And so that means that event was seen or engaged with hundreds or thousands of people via podcast form.
Yeah, I was thinking about the issue of expanding audience by either a podcast kind of thing or holding events at other locations, because I'm sure each location has their own audience, so that one hopes will add to yours and create permanent audience members that are new to the Y. Seems like.
It's interesting. Oh, go ahead, Bernard.
No, Ricky, go ahead.
I just wanted to say the effect of the pandemic on audiences, not only were we seeing more folks come to readings, we've had our most attended event in the history of the Poetry Center last September, if I remember it correctly, but we had workshops bringing in folks from all the way to like Australia, Germany, and the US, meeting simultaneously for a workshop. And that keeps happening to some degree through readings or literary seminars, right? Like, people are still coming. What we perceived was, or assumed was, a local a local phenomenon, which is come to the Y, experience this. It's something that was we were able to replicate all over the world thanks to accessibility, right? Making these these workshops available online, readings are transmitted simultaneously, and then they're posted online after a few weeks.
So it sounds like you're really using things learned in the pandemic in terms of technology to expand too, and to keep things expanding. Yeah. Bernard, did you want to add anything?
I don't remember what I was going to add, but yeah, no.
I'd love to hear a little bit just about each of your own writing. And I'm going to kind of put you on the spot, Ricardo, because I loved this. I'm going to quote you from an article that I read. We live in a world that's saturated with language, and poetry helps us understand that world beyond its surface. Mm-hmm. And I just wondered if you would have anything to add to that, or want to open that up in other ways, or it's just a beautiful.
Sure. I mean, in part, this reading of it came really as from a project I did with one of my colleagues, Ava Lehrer, who should be somewhere in this room, where we invited poets to look at language that they could find in the city or where they lived, and incorporate that into their own writing. And I have to say, partly because I come from Puerto Rico, and so there are language streams in all sorts of languages happening. There's Spanish, there's Puerto Rican Spanish, there's English, there's Spanglish, all of these streams populating my life, which means I am code switching often here, but also when I'm in the States, right, in the greater United States. So I feel like what poetry has given me is the ability to learn how to hold them individually and thread them together, if that makes any sense.
No, it's a lovely image, that of braiding these languages and having really bringing out their bodies together.
But and I also want to say, because I've been thinking about this recently, that for me poetry came at an initial moment of bewilderment, and that's something I still experience. That's a reason why I feel so close to Ashbery's work, for example, whose work seems to channel a kind of bewilderment, but then a sort of like compulsion towards meeting, right? Getting together. And I feel like the experience that I had as a non-native English speaker, it feels very similar to reading an Ashbery poem, right? The adults are speaking in English, but I don't necessarily understand what they're saying, or I think I do.
Yeah, no, that get a very tactile sense of language, it sounds like. Really, really good. And I'm going to switch over to you, Bernard. I really liked your piece on Dylan Thomas and authorial afterlives, and I wondered if you're taking that notion of the authorial afterlife in other directions, looking at other writers, or where your writing's going from here.
Yeah, I mean, I am very interested as a writer or an archivist or a historian, a compiler, in what the Poetry Center has been up to all these years, and always somewhat enchanted to encounter academics who express an interest in a place like the Poetry Center, because I'm not an academic. I just have, many hundreds, if not thousands of experiences to draw some kind of ideas from. And so when you interact with them, they're sort of all theory and no experience, and we're all experience and no theory. And you can generate a lot of ideas out of that kind of marriage. I mean, I'm overstating it or understating it, but the point is, it's a weird thing to be at a place that's been around for 85 years, to inherit all of these relationships, to forge new relationships, and to see what happens to a writer, their work, their legacy, when they are no longer alive. I mean, I think the idea of the Strand poem about Wallace Stevens, it sort of hits the nail on the head. And am even interested in this sort of specificity of what someone like Mark Strand thought he was doing in that poem, or the poem that came and actually was published in the New Yorker several months later, called The Great Poet Returns. We have no explanation for why Mark Strand's poem that I read earlier was never published. None, right? It was bought by the New Yorker. One suspects, and the simplest answer is that it wasn't published because Mark didn't want it published. And so why didn't he want it published? Maybe the answer is that he did better in The Great Poet Returns. I don't know, but there in that mystery, there is something interesting to me. There in the relationship between Stevens and Strand, Stevens' work and Strand's work, is what's interesting to me. And trying to compile enough sort of primary source material, the writers in their own voices, in their own kind of historical context, to kind of tease out what those mysteries might be, not to resolve them, but to be ensorcelled by them and to have readers as well.
Mhm.
I was thinking it's so interesting too that he chose the Y as a kind of mediation spot to a place where, in a sense, he could meet with Stevens.
Exactly, and for me, it sort of underlines the sorts of ideas that I was playing with in that Dylan Thomas piece. I mean, people walk into that concert hall as if it's a site of pilgrimage. But it's also important to say, because also it's fun and moving to say that, other people walk into the Y because it's where they, met their spouse. Like they had a dance 50 years ago and they want to come back and see the room or show their grandkids. So these sites of cultural memory that are ongoing are sort of the lifeblood of the institution, and it's incredibly moving to walk around this place
and to feel that history. Yeah,
and to feel it embodied, right? We're not a museum, we're not a library. I had to shut my door and put a sign on it because people will be running down the halls or bursting in.
Yeah, that's what sets it aside from, say, a place like a Barnes and Noble, right? It is a community center where priorities are shifting constantly, and the poetry is in those, like, there are moments between things where that are charged with poetry, even if it's a reading, right? Or the reading of a poem quietly by an administrator in a corner.
Yeah. I'm forgetting the exact context, but I'm remembering the term collective memory from that article on Thomas and the afterlife. And so I'm thinking about community as collective memory, but also a collective projection. And the idea of the grandchildren being shown seems to suggest that collective projection into the future as well.
Yeah, that's right. But it's embodied by both those individuals, right? The memory is transmitted and the physical spaces still exist. So what a charge people get out of doing that, remembering in the spaces, those experiences have happened, are happening, and will continue to happen.
Maybe that's a good note to segue into opening up to have other people ask questions and make comments. But first, thank you very much. Just really, really lovely conversation. So thank you both for that. And I'll turn it over to you, Eleanor, to orchestrate the conversation now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cole, and thank you, Ricky and Bernard. It's been such a great conversation. Such an amazing history. Our first question I'll be asking on behalf of Clark from the audience. Clark is wondering, are there known losses to your files, events that fell between the archival cracks, which you most lament or are still perhaps searching for?
A great question.
Yeah, I mean, that's, there's a long answer to that, but I think Cole touched on something earlier, which I would re-emphasize, which is, on the one hand, there are events that occurred that were not recorded, and that happened long enough ago that likely there aren't people alive to remember them. It wasn't always the case that we recorded as consistently as we began to do. But in that slideshow, you know, there's a brochure. Any given season's features, you know, 30, 40 events. And as Ricky said, countless classes. Those 30, 40 events, the slideshow is but the highlights of highlights of those events. So in any given year, it's true that those events are recorded and that they are remembered, and that we as administrators pay very close attention to what they are. But 20, 50, 100 years later, are those the ones that the Y is promoting? It sort of depends on what became of those individuals. It's also worth asking what role we would have played in what became with the art of those individuals. So as Ricky said something about canonicity, you know, we're very aware that we're doing a lot that viewed retrospectively will not be recorded in the way that in a more public relations sort of way, the institutions like the Y, you know, will trumpet their you know, their highlights. But I would also say to close that you know, Ricky and I program as if we are making an archive. So it's important to us that we have lots of people come to events in the here and now. That's one metric by which you interpret the success of something, but it's not the only one. And we have both always been inspired by the idea that you would do something today that would be meaningful or more meaningful later on. And later on could be next week, or it could be next century.
I also wanted to add, perhaps stress an earlier point, which you alluded to, Bernard, as well, that it's easy to assume that the event is what happens on the stage, but we are missing the hundreds of souls who walk in and take the event with them. What do we make of, say, later on, much later after class is over, that we hear that, say, Sarah Broom worked on the Yellow House, initial idea of the Yellow House at a workshop, or that Claudia Rankin, when she was trying to determine whether or not she wanted to study law or creative writing, took a workshop at the Y, or that Sapphire worked on her book in Marie Ponceau's workshop. How can we account for that? How can we find those intersections that otherwise we wouldn't have a record of, right? So it's just constantly remembering that there's a lot that will be lost, but that hopefully will come back, and like we will be able as administrators to discover, because we are invested in cultivation of writers from day one, from the moment they decide to pick up a pen. And in many cases, they will come back to us and tell us, I was in this workshop, or I did this, or I was in the concert hall when this event took place. That happens often.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that question, Clark. And thanks for those great answers. Our next question is going to be from GE.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you, Cole. Thank you, Ricardo, and thank you, Bernard, for keeping this alive. Question is, could you talk a little bit about the running programs that reach out to schools and some of the people that might have been involved in those programs?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, Wendy is here, right? I think you may know her. Yeah, I think the in the same way that you make programs for the future, we and this is directly because of the fact that Ricky and I worked so closely with Wendy for years and years, make programs for kids, you know. And I think the idea that you would have a reading series for the general public that privileged the experience of, you know, a core group of audience members who happen to be New York City high school students is something that Wendy taught us. And you know, her example, I think, you know, is something that we take very seriously. But to answer sort of more kind of or less personally, I would say the Y in many different areas does community and education outreach, and like the Young Writers Workshop, we have in our reading series often facilitated on-site school visits by chiefly Wendy, who is the founder of the Literature Project, where they do creative writing. They then come to meet visiting authors. They get some pizza. They get free copies of the books that the featured authors have newly published. And at the end of the term, there's often a student reading. That's a program which moved online during the pandemic and expanded to an extent, featuring not just literary artists, but musicians and other figures of note, and will sort of return, you know, this fall to its sort of familiar historical form, we hope. So yeah, you know, thanks for the question. And like I said, there are a lot of different ways in which you can think about where the idea for public programs come from. And right at the top of the list for us is this going to be cool for kids?
Absolutely.
Thank you, GE. That was such a good one. I would like to ask a question to you both. I'm wondering kind of how you think the 92nd Street Y has been able to survive and thrive for as long as it has, and become such a staple and institution in New York and beyond. And I guess kind of how you stay kind of relevant and adapt to what is going on in the moment.
Well, I'm going to answer with the Poetry Center in mind, because I can't answer or provide an answer for the 92nd Street Y as a whole, other than it is an institution with access to resources and a community, right? Because it has been a community center for about 150 years. In fact, we're entering our 150th. And the simplest way I can answer is about the Poetry Center is because of us, people like us, right? It takes a very specific mindset to know that literature can do something, and that you can be there to increase access to that thing. And I felt very lucky to be a part of the Poetry Center, not because I had access to a stage, but because I had access to conversations that I wouldn't have ordinarily, I wouldn't ordinarily have outside of a place like the Poetry Center, because it was a center as a community, right? Like, Wendy, Bernard, and I would have conversations about Shirley Hazard for hours, for example, specifically the Transit of Venus, or a poem we just read, right? And so we were constantly seeking out literature, not because it was a hobby and not just because we enjoyed it, but because we saw something in literature that could potentially be transformative to younger writers, to our communities, to the art form. And I feel like really that's what it takes. People who feel deeply honored to be in that position and to understand that you're not in it for yourself, you're in it for a community. But that's my answer. I'll let Bernard tackle it if he wants to add something or even correct me.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, except, if you take, and I think part of or largely the context for Eleanor's question is around the pandemic. The why survived the pandemic because, as Ricky said, it has access to resources, and there were incredibly hardworking people who didn't stop. One of them is Ricky. We were lucky and continue to be lucky in the sense that our thing translates or transfers very well to online. We continue to see the positive results of that, which in practical terms means that people pay to take our classes. And in more creative terms, it means because we're not bound by those who are, living in New York City, and that means neither the instructors nor the students. We're gonna, play this out for as long as possible. The why, another advantage of the pandemic, if I may say it in that way, which makes me shudder, is it gave the Poetry Center access to all these rooms that the Y as a physical plant does not have, and certainly has fewer of at the moment as the institution embarks on all kinds of renovations. So the Poetry Center just kind of floats now, or touches down in Zoom rooms like this many times a week. The center stupefyingly does many more programs now than we did pre-pandemic, and the extent to which that's sort of sustainable, I don't know, but certainly we have continued to prove ourselves as worthy contributors to the institution's bottom line, and that sort of feels good to us. It's reassuring to us that we don't face any kind of existential peril. I don't think. No, I'm confident that we don't. It feels good to us, even as we are not, responsible for the business side of things.
Thank you so much. Our last question today will be from Chloe.
Hi, Bernard. Hi, Ricardo. Thank you so much for this conversation today. It's been very inspiring to hear about the history of the Y and all of your incredible work over the years, working with poets and writers and individuals at the organization. I have a question for each of you. Bernard, one of the mottos that's on about 92nd Street Y is always love the words. And I wonder what that means to you specifically and how maybe that's adapted for you over your time at the Y. And while you're answering that, Ricardo, I'm curious what from your experience at the Y you most look forward to taking with you in your new role at the American Academy.
Well, thanks for having us, Chloe. And love the words is whether or not this is true or not, we say that it happened. What Dylan Thomas said to these actors who were the first to perform under Milkwood here in 1953. I hope that he said it. He was, well, who knows? What I like about that story is that the actors who joined Dylan Thomas on the stage who had very little time to prepare that performance, which, as I say, is recorded and publicly available and is wonderful, is they all worked at the Y. They were working actors who had day jobs answering the phones here or teaching classes. And it's really kind of hard to imagine a present day scenario in which the person in Maya Rickey's position suggested to an arriving poet who was putting on a play that we derive other members of the cast from the rank and file of the institution. I can think of some people here who are really wonderful artists and musicians, but actors I'm not sure about. I think Love the Words is as Ricky has said it again and again, the idea of community and bringing writers and readers together at all sorts of levels for all sorts of reasons, but unified by that sort of thing. We are a community center, really first and foremost, and simply, right? And I think the idea of stewarding a community, or a community made up of all sorts of communities, is a good reason to get out of bed in the morning. And that this one happens to be, you know, people who write, read, and appreciate literature is incredibly humanizing.
Indeed. Thank you for that answer, Bernard. I don't know what I'm bringing with me other than faith. You know, it's interesting because it's been now a few weeks since I stopped or the ending of my tenure at the Y, and it's fair to say that I'm haunted by writers I could never invite, could never host. Some of them are here in this room, and you know, I know that I'm still learning. I'm a poet, so there's a whole canon of poets I haven't been able to access because of time, because of work, because of life. And for me, reading is, not to be a little bit on the nose, but like, it's a life assignment. And I hope that I will be able to bring in those voices that I was not able to host at the Y, just simply as a matter, because of time, right? Like, I hope I can bring them along next time, because I've learned a lot from the page and in community, and that's definitely the spirit I'm bringing, and it's already there. I'm sure it's already there. I met some great future colleagues, but I was a teacher and I was a student, and I feel like that's me. That's the me that's coming to the academy, and I'm really honored that they made space for that, and that person certainly wouldn't have existed without Bernard and Wendy and Ava and Sophie and Chris, and I could just keep naming my colleagues throughout the years.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those answers.
Thanks for that question, Chloe, for wrapping us up. And I think we have one more poetry reading today.
Yes.
Ricky.
So I've been sort of like changing my mind as we go. I wanted to end by reading a poem by John Ashbery, who won our Discovery Contest in 1952. But I decided to read something a little bit more recent, and this is by 2019 Discovery winner Oma Tara James. Her book is coming out from Alice James in the summer, but she also teaches for us, and teaches creative writing, specifically poetry for us, has done so throughout the pandemic, and also served as preliminary judge for our Discovery Contest this past year. So I feel like this is in many ways as a sign of appreciation for her work and her presence in our lives and contributions to our history. So I'm just going to read this poem, which was published in the Paris Review Daily. I'm posting it on the site, on the chat. For those who want to follow along, there's also a manuscript version, i.e. a first draft that she sent to us. Promise. When they send the robot to replace me, do not be gentle with it. Place these chords where its heart chakra should be. Do not speak to it of a fountain. Tell it in the middle of its life there will be a flower, a blooming petaled trauma. Tell it I considered beauty once, but there were white iced gingerbread cookies brown with molasses in the ceramic black Santa jar. My father's mangoes, green, red, and yellow, were in a wooden bowl on the kitchen counter, unharmed, having traveled so far beyond their home. There were the last hours before sleep when mother borrowed energy from the next day to make at least 3 nights worth of dinners for us, until the night roused me with more night and I masticated with tongue, masticated with teeth, masticated in my sleeping gown, masticated beneath the sheets, masticated in the bathroom stalls at school, so quiet you wouldn't hear me over the sound of a raindrop. I am a masticator. I will masticate until there's nothing, until I'm full, until I'm done.
Thank you so much, Ricky. That was an amazing.
It's quite a poem.
Perfect way to end.
incredible.
Perfect. Great.
Perfect conclusion to this wonderful conversation. Thank you again, Bernard and Ricardo and Cole. It's been such a treat today. We would also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for supporting our archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel, and this conversation will be up there shortly. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like this, our daily NSE. Check the chat for a link to support the Rail, and join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Beatriz Cortez and Chloe Stagaman on the event of The Volcano That Left at Storm King. We will conclude with a reading by Laura Jaramillo. And you can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thanks all for tuning in today. I hope you have
Gracias. Thank
a
you
lovely
all.
rest of your
Thank
day.
you so much.
Thank you.
That was so
Thanks so much,
inspiring.
everyone.
See you, Erica.
Great
Lane,
conversation.
Thank you.
Wendy.
Thank you.
Good to see
Great
you all.
poem.
Thank you so
Have a
much.
good one.
Thank
Have
you
an
all.
amazing
Amazing
rest of your
reading.
day, everybody.